warning to our viewers. What you're about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. April 16, 1996, a crisp spring morning in Manchester, England. The doors of the Gorton Police Station swing open as a middle-aged man walks in with disturbing composure. His hands are clean, his demeanor unnervedly calm, but his soul is stained with unimaginable brutality. "I've killed her. I know I have," he confesses matter-of-factly to the desk sergeant, as though reporting a minor traffic incident. "She's in the bath." "I think I've killed her." Within minutes, officers arrive at the modest, semi-detached house on Furnival Road. What they discover inside stops even the most hardened detectives in their tracks. Blood spatters mark the walls of every room, and upstairs, lying motionless, they find the body of 17-year-old Kellyanne Bates. What these officers witnessed that day would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Evidence of weeks of systematic torture so extreme that the pathologist would later describe her injuries as the worst he had seen in over 600 murder cases. Before we continue again, I must warn you. What follows contains descriptions of extreme violence and torture that many will find deeply disturbing. If accounts of severe abuse and torture are triggering for you, now would be the time to stop watching. For those who choose to continue, I ask that you remember the human being at the center of this tragedy. Welcome to the Shadow Files crime series. Tonight's case will shake you to your core. Take a moment to hit subscribe, drop a like, and please let us know where you're watching from. And now, we begin. The mid-1990s in Manchester, England, was a time of transition. Once the powerhouse of Britain's Industrial Revolution, the city was slowly reinventing itself after decades of economic decline. Post-industrial Manchester still bore the scars of unemployment and urban decay, particularly in its working-class districts. Hattersley, where Kellyanne Bates grew up, was a housing estate built in the 1960s to rehouse families from Manchester's inner-city slums. By the 90s, it had developed into a close-knit community where neighbors looked out for one another, where family roots ran deep, and where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. 8 miles away in Gorton, where James Patterson Smith lived, the landscape was similar. Rows of modest terraced houses and semi-detached homes where residents often lived for decades. Smith's house on Furnival Road was unremarkable, a 2-bedroom semi in a quiet cul-de-sac that never drew attention. These were communities where people recognized faces, where strangers stood out, where a teenager's absence would typically raise questions. Yet somehow, behind an ordinary front door, Kellyanne Bates endured weeks of unimaginable torture without intervention. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case, how such extreme violence remained hidden in plain sight, in streets where children played, where people passed by daily, completely unaware of the horror unfolding just feet away from them. How could something so monstrous happen in a place where, supposedly, everyone knew everyone? On a spring day in 1978, May 18th to be exact, Kellyanne Bates was born to Margaret and Tommy Bates in Hattersley, Greater Manchester. Growing up in this working-class community, Kellyanne quickly revealed herself to be a bright, energetic child with a natural warmth that drew others to her. Home videos and photographs from her childhood show a smiling girl with expressive eyes and an infectious laugh. Friends from her early years would later describe her as kind-hearted and loyal, someone who stood up for others and rarely complained about her own troubles. At school, Kellyanne flourished both academically and athletically. She particularly excelled in track events, her natural speed and determination making her a standout performer. Teachers noted her enthusiasm for learning and her thoughtful participation in classroom discussions. Kelly was the kind of student who made teaching worthwhile, one former teacher recalled. She was curious about the world and genuinely cared about others. You could see that in how she interacted with everyone around her. By her mid-teens, Kellyanne had developed a clear vision for her future. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, inspired perhaps by those who had recognized her potential. In 1994, she enrolled in college in Hyde to improve her GCSE results. determined to secure a place in a teacher training program. To support herself through her studies, she took a part-time job at K2 Graphics in Audenshaw, where colleagues remembered her as hardworking and reliable. Like many teenagers in the mid-90s, Kellyanne enjoyed music, taking particular pleasure in the emerging Britpop scene, and spent weekends with friends at local shops and cafes. She kept a diary, wrote poetry, and maintained a close relationship with her mother, Margaret, who would later describe their bond as one filled with laughter and mutual respect. She was just finding herself, just like any other teenager, Margaret would later tell reporters, her voice breaking with emotion. She had all these plans, all these dreams about becoming a teacher, about traveling, about her whole life ahead of her. None of those who knew Kellyanne could have imagined that her bright future would be extinguished so brutally, or that the man who would destroy it was already watching from the shadows, waiting for his opportunity. James Patterson Smith was born around 1948 in Manchester. By the time he met Kelly, he was 48 years old, a man who had spent decades perfecting his dual nature. To the outside world, Smith presented a carefully crafted image of respectability. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as well-groomed and house-proud. His modest, semi-detached home on Furnival Road was immaculately maintained, reflecting a man who appeared to value order and cleanliness. Unlike many perpetrators of extreme violence, Smith didn't drink alcohol or use drugs. He was a teetotaler and non-smoker who maintained a neat appearance and quiet demeanor. This facade of respectability helped him blend seamlessly into the community. People who knew him casually might describe him as unremarkable, perhaps even a model citizen. But behind closed doors existed an entirely different man, a man consumed by pathological jealousy and an insatiable need for control. Smith's violent tendencies first came to public light through his marriage, which ended in 1980 after 10 years due to his escalating abuse. His ex-wife would later testify to his possessive nature and hair-trigger temper, describing how his initially charming personality gradually gave way to something far more sinister. Following his divorce, Smith's pattern of targeting vulnerable women continued. From 1980 to 1982, he began a relationship with 20-year-old Tina Watson. According to her later testimony, Smith systematically broke down her self-esteem and isolated her from friends and family. Watson described being used as a punch bag, enduring regular beatings that intensified when she became pregnant with his child. At first it was now and again, just a little tap, Watson recalled. But in the end it was every day. He would smack me in the face or hit me over the head with an ashtray. He would kick me in the legs or between the legs. Most chillingly, during one incident, Smith attempted to drown Watson while she was bathing, a horrifying precursor to what would later happen to Kelly. After Watson managed to escape the relationship, Smith quickly found another vulnerable target. In 1982, he began a relationship with 15-year-old Wendy Mottershead. The pattern repeated: isolation, control, and escalating violence. Mottershead later revealed that Smith had once held her head underwater in the kitchen sink, attempting to drown her. "It frightened me," Mottershead later testified. "But you get to the point where you're too frightened to do anything or say anything. You just took it." These weren't simply angry outbursts, but deliberate acts of dominance, systematic attempts to establish absolute control through terror. Psychiatric experts would later suggest Smith suffered from a severe paranoid disorder with morbid jealousy, living in what was described as a distorted reality. What makes Smith's case particularly disturbing is how effectively he compartmentalized his behavior. Neighbors never reported disturbances. There were no drunken incidents or public outbursts. The monster remained perfectly contained behind the walls of his ordinary home, emerging only when he had his victims completely isolated and under his control. This was the man who had set his sights on 14-year-old Kellyanne Bates in 1993, not as a sudden predatory impulse, but as the next victim in a calculated pattern that had been developing for decades. In 1993, Kellyanne Bates was just 14 years old, a schoolgirl with her life ahead of her. James Patterson Smith was 45, a middle-aged man with a hidden history of violence. Their paths crossed in the most mundane of circumstances when Kelly was babysitting for one of Smith's friends. After she finished her babysitting duties that evening, Smith offered to walk her home to keep her safe. This seemingly protective gesture was the first step in a calculated grooming process. Smith positioned himself as a guardian figure, a mature man who could offer protection and guidance to a young girl navigating adolescence. For Kelly, a teenager experiencing the natural desire for independence, Smith's attention likely felt flattering, a validation of her maturity. Over the coming months, Smith cultivated their connection carefully. He listened to Kelly's teenage problems, offered advice, and positioned himself as the one person who truly understood her. This is the insidious nature of grooming. It masquerades as care, while systematically isolating the victim from their natural support systems. Kelly kept the relationship secret from her parents for nearly 2 years, understanding intuitively that they would disapprove of the age gap. When she spoke of him at all, she referred to him as Dave rather than Jim, and claimed he was 32, still significantly older, but not the 45-year-old predator he actually was. It wasn't until Kelly was 16 that Margaret Bates would finally meet the man who had been secretly seeing her daughter. One day, Margaret returned home to find Kelly waiting in the kitchen. Moments later, she heard footsteps on the stairs as Smith descended into the room. Margaret would later describe that moment with chilling clarity. "As I walked in, he swaggered down the stairs, and it made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. He was much older than I expected and looked a bit like John Denver, but he was smarmy. He said, 'Nice to meet you at last,' and all I could think of was how I wanted to get rid of him." What happened next would haunt Margaret Bates for the rest of her life. As Smith stood in her kitchen, Margaret experienced an overwhelming urge to act. "I vividly recall seeing our bread knife in the kitchen and wanting to pick it up and stab him in the back," she later revealed. "It was a bizarre thought. I would never normally think of anything so violent, and now I wonder whether it was some sort of sixth sense. That premonition, that visceral, instinctive warning would prove tragically prophetic." Following their initial meeting, Margaret Bates tried repeatedly to dissuade her daughter from continuing the relationship with Smith. "I tried everything I could to get Kellyanne away from him," she would later say. But by then, Smith's influence had taken root. Kelly began pulling away from her family and friends, the classic first step in an abuser's playbook. As Smith's control deepened, Kelly's once vibrant personality began to dim. Friends who had known her as outgoing and confident noticed her becoming increasingly withdrawn. She started making excuses to avoid social gatherings and gradually disappeared from the lives of those who cared about her. In November 1995, shortly after turning 17, Kelly made the fateful decision to move in with Smith at his home on Furnival Road in Gorton. Her parents, though deeply concerned, had limited options to intervene. Under UK law, Kelly was over 16, legally able to make her own decisions about where and with whom she lived. The signs of abuse emerged quickly. During her increasingly rare visits home, Kelly's parents noticed bruises on her arms and body. When questioned, she offered the textbook excuses that domestic abuse victims often provide. She'd walked into a door, she'd fallen downstairs, she was just clumsy. On one occasion, she arrived with a black eye, claiming she had been attacked by a gang of girls after school. Tommy and Margaret Bates watched helplessly as their daughter's independence was systematically stripped away. In December 1995, just weeks after moving in with Smith, Kelly quit her job at the graphics firm, cutting off not only her financial independence, but also her daily contact with people outside Smith's control. As Christmas approached, Kelly's absence from family celebrations marked another red flag. The holiday came and went without her appearance, unprecedented in a family that had always been close. Phone calls became increasingly sporadic, and when they did occur, Margaret noted something different in her daughter's voice. Hesitations, strange pauses, as though someone was monitoring what she said. In March 1996, the family received 2 cards, one for Tommy's birthday and another for their wedding anniversary. Neither contained Kelly's handwriting. Both had been signed by Smith on her behalf. This alarming development prompted Margaret to suggest visiting Smith's house, but Tommy was hesitant, hoping their daughter would reach out when ready. "I tried to persuade my husband to go round," Margaret later recalled. "I was concerned he had written the cards himself to wind me up, or he had her tied up, or he'd hurt her in some way that she could not write the cards herself. When Kelly's brother attempted to visit her at Smith's house, he was told she wasn't home. A concerned neighbor who inquired after her was briefly shown Kelly at an upstairs window, a disturbing glimpse that would later be understood as Smith demonstrating his control." The last confirmed sighting of Kelly alive by someone outside the house was in November 1995, shortly after she moved in with Smith. For the next 5 months, her existence would be hidden behind the walls of Smith's house, her suffering invisible to the outside world. Despite the Bates family's growing alarm, they faced the painful limitations of the law. Without concrete evidence of abuse, and with Kelly being a legal adult, authorities had limited grounds to intervene, a tragic gap in protection that would have fatal consequences. What happened to Kellyanne Bates in the final month of her life represents one of the most disturbing cases of sustained torture ever documented in British criminal history. While the full details are almost too horrific to comprehend, understanding the systematic nature of her suffering is crucial to grasping both the depravity of Smith's actions and the complete vulnerability of Kelly's position. By March 1996, Kelly had essentially disappeared from the outside world. No phone calls, no sightings, no communication with family or friends. Court evidence would later reveal that during this period, Kelly was no longer a girlfriend or even a domestic abuse victim. She had become a prisoner in Smith's house. For approximately 4 weeks, Smith subjected Kelly to a calculated regime of torture that defies understanding. The evidence indicated he frequently bound her, sometimes tying her by her hair to radiators or furniture. At other times, he secured a ligature around her neck, tethering her like an animal, restricting her movement to further assert his complete dominance. The medical examiner's report revealed that during this period, Kelly was systematically starved. She lost approximately 20 kilograms, 44 pounds, in weight, and evidence suggested she had been deprived of water for several days before her death. This deliberate starvation weakened her physically, making resistance increasingly impossible as the torture escalated. What separated Smith's actions from many other cases of extreme violence was the methodical, prolonged nature of the abuse. This wasn't a single explosive outburst of rage, but a sustained campaign of torture that increased in severity over time. The medical evidence revealed injuries in various stages of healing, confirming the prosecution's assertion that Smith was deliberately and systematically torturing Kelly over an extended period. Among the most disturbing aspects of the case was the evidence that Smith had gouged out Kelly's eyes, an act that forensic experts determined had occurred between 5 days and 3 weeks before her death. This meant that for the final period of her life, Kelly endured her ongoing torture while completely blind, amplifying her terror and helplessness. Beyond the physical violence, Smith subjected Kelly to profound psychological torture, the kind that breaks not just the body, but the spirit. The total isolation, the unpredictability of his attacks, and the complete power imbalance created a psychological prison as effective as any physical restraints. Prosecutor Peter Openshaw would later tell the court, "It was as if he deliberately disfigured her, causing her the utmost pain, distress, and degradation." The injuries were not the result of one sudden eruption of violence. They must have been caused over a long period, and were so extensive and so terrible that the defendant must have deliberately and systematically tortured the girl. The methodical cruelty suggests Smith derived satisfaction not just from inflicting pain, but from the complete control he exercised over another human being. Psychiatric experts would later suggest his actions reflected a profound pathology, a need to utterly dominate and destroy that went beyond even typical cases of domestic violence. Throughout this final month, Kelly remained hidden behind the walls of an ordinary house on an ordinary street. The extraordinary horror of her situation, invisible to neighbors who passed by daily, unaware of the young woman's suffering just feet away from them. On April 16, 1996, at approximately 9 a.m., James Patterson Smith walked into Gorton Police Station. His demeanor was unnervingly calm as he approached the front desk and made a startling announcement. "I've killed her. I know I've killed her." Officers on duty were struck by his matter-of-fact tone as he explained that his girlfriend had accidentally drowned during an argument while she was in the bath. According to Smith, Kelly had swallowed bathwater, and despite his attempts at resuscitation, she had died. He added the bizarre claim that she often pretended to be unconscious, suggesting he initially thought she was faking. "I know I'm going away," Smith told the officers. "I know there is no point. I'm going to get found out anyway." Police officers were immediately dispatched to Smith's address on Furnival Road. What they discovered upon entering the house would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Blood was found throughout the property, not just isolated spots, but smears and splatters across walls, floors, and ceilings in every room. The officers followed the grim trail to an upstairs bedroom where they found Kelly's body. The initial observations at the scene made it immediately clear that this was no accidental drowning. The visible injuries on Kelly's body told a story of prolonged, extreme violence that contradicted Smith's account entirely. Detective Sergeant Joseph Monahan, who headed the murder inquiry, would later state, "I have been in the police force for 15 years and have never seen a case as horrific as this." His sentiment was echoed by every officer involved in the investigation. Veterans who thought they had seen the worst humanity could offer found themselves profoundly shaken by what had been done to Kellyanne Bates. The forensic investigation that followed was painstaking and disturbing. Home Office pathologist Dr. William Lawler performed the post-mortem examination, methodically documenting over 150 separate injuries across Kelly's body. As each injury was catalogued and photographed, the horrifying extent of her suffering became increasingly clear. Standing in the witness box during Smith's trial, Dr. Lawler, a man who had examined approximately 600 murder victims throughout his career, made a statement that underscored the exceptional brutality of the case. "I have never come across injuries so extensive." The official cause of death was drowning, but the pathology report revealed that immediately before being submerged, Kelly had been beaten about the head with a shower head, a final act of violence before the drowning that ended her life. James Patterson Smith's trial began at Manchester Crown Court in November 1997. From the outset, his defense strategy revealed the disturbing workings of his mind. Despite the overwhelming physical evidence, Smith maintained his innocence, offering explanations that ranged from implausible to utterly delusional. "She would put me through hell, winding me up," Smith told the court, attempting to position himself as the victim. He claimed Kelly had taunted him about his dead mother and suggested that many of her injuries were self-inflicted. "She has a bad habit of hurting herself to make it look worse on me," he stated with chilling detachment. When pressed by the prosecution to explain the gouging of Kelly's eyes, Smith offered perhaps his most disturbing response. He claimed she had challenged him to do it, daring him to harm her. Dr. Julian Mezzi, a consultant psychiatrist, testified that Smith suffered from a severe paranoid disorder with morbid jealousy and lived in what she described as a distorted reality, a clinical assessment that, while explaining his psychology, did nothing to diminish his culpability. The jury was unmoved by Smith's defense. After hearing the overwhelming evidence and viewing the harrowing photographs documenting Kelly's injuries, they took just 1 hour to reach their verdict: guilty of murder. On November 19, 1997, Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 20 years before being considered for parole. Judge Mr. Justice Sachs delivered a powerful statement during sentencing. "This has been a terrible case. A catalogue of depravity by one human being upon another. You are a highly dangerous person. You are an abuser of women, and I intend, so far as it is in my power, that you will abuse no more." In an unprecedented move, the court offered professional counseling to all members of the jury to help them process the psychological trauma of the evidence they had been required to consider. All jurors accepted this support. The murder of Kellyanne Bates left wounds that would never fully heal for those who loved her. For Margaret Bates, her daughter's death brought not only overwhelming grief, but a burden of regret that would haunt her for decades. "I had been waiting for the knock on the door," Margaret said, referring to the police officers who came to inform her of Kelly's death. "But nobody believed me." That maternal intuition, the sixth sense that had prompted her urge to grab a knife when she first met Smith, became both a source of torment and a driving force in her life moving forward. Following Kelly's murder, Margaret channeled her grief into advocacy, working with domestic violence organizations to help educate young people about the warning signs of controlling relationships. She has spoken openly about her experience, hoping that by sharing Kelly's story, other parents might recognize dangerous patterns before it's too late. The case had a profound impact on how authorities in Greater Manchester approach domestic violence. The recognition that abuse can escalate to extreme levels even when victims are not regularly visiting hospital emergency rooms or calling police led to enhanced training for officers in identifying high-risk situations and intervening earlier. Perhaps most significantly, Kelly's case highlighted how effectively abusers can isolate their victims, creating situations where even in densely populated areas, someone can essentially disappear while technically still living in the community. This understanding has informed modern approaches to welfare checks and missing persons investigations, particularly involving young adults who may legally choose their living situations but might be under coercive control. The warning signs that appeared throughout Kelly's relationship with Smith, the age gap, the isolation, the unexplained injuries, the withdrawal from work and social circles, are now widely taught as red flags in educational programs about domestic abuse. These patterns of control and manipulation that once might have been dismissed as merely concerning are now recognized as potentially lethal risk factors. As we reflect on Kelly's life, it's important to remember that she was not defined by her death. She was a young woman with dreams of becoming a teacher, with a laugh that lit up rooms, with friends who cherished her, and with a family who loved her deeply. Her life mattered, not just as a cautionary tale, but for all the joy and potential it contained. For anyone experiencing domestic abuse, please remember that help is available. In the UK, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline is available 24/7 at 808-2247. In the US, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. Kellyanne Bates deserved a future that was stolen from her. Her memory now serves as a powerful reminder that what happens behind closed doors can escalate to unimaginable extremes, and that recognizing the warning signs may save lives. If you enjoyed this content, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep creating content we're passionate about sharing with you.